Hi, Ian. Hi, Brian.
Hello, how are you?
Ah, we're live on Facebook. Good morning, everyone. How are things? Karen, you said we were just talking briefly before I went live on Facebook and the others joined us. So you can't get away from the work, the Gurdjieff work. It just
Right.
permeates your whole life. And
It does. It does. In a good way, except
yeah,
occasionally when I just think this is this is hard. It's hard work.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
but I'm so grateful for it. I don't know how I could be growing old without it. So
Yeah.
it's everything.
I mean, I describe to my clients that it's like a prism, not a prison, but a prism that I look through and I understand everything through it. Um, it's, when I see my clients, when I see them broken, I see them leaking energy. I see, it's whether it's the head, the heart, or the body, and, different approaches. And it's my whole life is filtered through these teachings. And it's like I carry this thing in front of me and I perceive everything through it. And it's a remarkable set of teachings in terms of understanding people, particularly as a hypnotherapist and a therapist for myself, just using them. I don't really bring them to the forefront with my clients, but I see everything through them. Uh,
Yeah.
Ian, how are you doing down there? 7:30 in Portland, Oregon. Um,
Oh, okay.
okay, 7:30.
Yeah.
I heard Portland was in the news again with some kind of demonstration and counter demonstration, and
I didn't find out about it until last night on Facebook, but apparently everything went real well. It was super quiet, no violence, no, fighting, nothing. The whole thing seemed to kind of be a dud, so I'm
yeah,
quite pleased about that.
yeah. And I guess you keep away from those things. You don't get worked up, and um, yeah. Oh, look, there's a little child. Must be their grandson. Oh, the volume's turned off. Um, hey, Brian, how are you doing?
Doing good, very good.
How's the inner work?
It's going well, and I would have to agree with Karen. Is thinking that it has it's been such a positive effect. It's like there at least a few times a day. If I get stuck on something, you can kind of put it through the prism that you were talking about, and it everything that's I would usually look at as a hassle or annoying or a negative thing, being able to flip that and make it find a way to kind of make it a positive thing. It just makes me a lot more productive, and I don't know. I mean, it's just like she said. I mean, I couldn't imagine not having it
Yeah.
as a tool for my own growth.
Yeah. It certainly makes suffering both harder and easier because you consciously suffer and you're working with suffering, but then you have to hold on to it and you've got to sit in it and you've got to experience it. And, you don't distract yourself and you don't try and find a way out of it. I was trying to explain this to someone yesterday, the nature of conscious suffering or intentional suffering, how we do it consciously. And when we do it consciously, it becomes a whole different form of suffering. In some ways, it's better, and in some ways, it's worse because we are mindful and aware of our suffering, but we're also growing something within ourselves, changing ourselves in the process.
Yeah, I think it also makes me much more disciplined in areas where I never realized that I lacked discipline in it. But it's very good.
Yeah. I was explaining to my Tuesday night group that there's a phrase, I forget I can't quote it exactly, but he who does small things well
Mm-hmm.
does big things well. And every once in a while, when I find myself thinking, maybe I can cut a corner here, maybe I can save a few hours of work, it's like, no, I have to do it properly. And the other one is when you go on a spree, go on the whole spree, including the hog. And it means, you know, you cross your T's, you dot your I's, you do everything properly. You don't try and take shortcuts. You do everything well. And I must admit, I've spent hours and hours redoing things that no one else would notice anything wrong with. They would think wonderful. But for me, I've got to redo it because, you know, if you go on a spree, go the whole hog, including the postage. And, you know, he who does small things well does large things well. So it's like a bane of my existence. Because when I was younger, I always tried to cut corners and do things, you know, without having to, you know, lay the proper foundation. But the older I get, I can't do that. I hear Mr. Gurdjieff's words in my head, and I think, no, I've got to go back and do that properly.
I completely agree with that, Allan. I mean, that's crept into my life too.
Yeah.
Everything has to be perfect, but not in a crazy perfectionistic way for the sake of it, but for the deeper understanding that I'm doing it right.
Yeah. It's so perfect. Everything has to be done right. You know, not to the level of where you could just tie yourself in circles, but when you see something and you go, you know, you don't overlook that. You go back and you get it so that you don't go, and you do it properly. And so it's when these teachings become part of our life, when they become sort of like blueprints and ways that we perceive the world and ways that we perceive ourselves, wonderful things happen. You know, I just find these teachings, you know, so remarkable. The deeper I go into them, the more I explore them, the more they manifest in my life. Something like Beelzebub Tales. Mr. Gurdjieff said that he didn't write that for the conscious mind. He wrote it for the subconscious mind. And when these things are sort of deep in you, they're actually in your subconscious. And when you become aware of them, you're harmonizing your conscious and your subconscious minds. You're bringing them together in that moment. And that's when true magic occurs. Does anyone have any questions about any inner work they're doing? Any blockages, any progress, anything they would like to share? Not just for us, but for those who are watching and will be watching later on YouTube.
I just have go ahead.
No, Brian, you go ahead first, and then we'll go to Ian.
Okay. It's not really a necessarily deals with like my personal inner work, but I am just very interested in music in general and it's how it affects our you know, how it affects our minds. And Gurdjieff has a quote that says, music alone cannot separate the whole of our unconscious automation, but it is one of the aids to this.
Okay.
And we don't have to do it today, but you know, at some time I'd like to get like a better understanding of just his perspective on music and the power of music, how it affects us, you know, what it can do for, you know, us individually and humanity as a whole.
Okay, this is a question that would take up a whole meeting, and it would be better if I prepared for it as well, because there's a lot of quotes that Mr. Gurdjieff gives about music. There have been books that other people have written about Mr. Gurdjieff and music, and so to marshal all of those into a very coherent fashion, but that will definitely become a meeting where I'll go in depth into it. Okay, Ian.
Just to kind of riff off of what Karen and Brian were saying, something that's been up for me lately pretty strongly is the question of sincerity. I think Mr. Gurdjieff said something along the lines of that's like one of the most important things starting out with the work is to be sincere with yourself, and that we are rarely, if ever, sincere with ourselves, and we have to learn how to do that. And I'm trying to watch for moments where I lie to myself about, you know, that sense of, you know, have I done a thing right? Have I done it well? Have I done it to the best of my abilities, or am I cutting corners? I notice that I often will sort of gloss over the feeling of something's a bit off, and then some story comes in. Oh, because I need to go do this thing, or I don't have time, or it doesn't matter. But most of that will often pass without my even noticing that it's happening. And so I'm trying to turn up my attention and catch those moments more consciously, and react to them.
Okay.
So not really a question, but you hit.
That's an observation.
Yeah.
How well is it going? You know, being able to catch yourself in those moments.
Hard to say how well it's going. It's definitely going. I can't think of any examples, but I know it's been active in me for a while now, like a week or two maybe, sort of at the forefront. But I feel I both feel pretty good about it, and also it's embarrassing to notice.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, but when I do catch something, there's a feeling of something in me almost shifting more into place. Like, oh, that was out of alignment and I didn't even notice. And now I feel more aware of some level of automation.
Yeah.
Porky pig over here. And I feel closer to myself than I did in the, you know, before I noticed this thing. In that moment, there's a feeling of, oh, and kind of a sinking in to my body, or to my general awareness, and being more, coming more from myself.
I like the way you put that, because Mr. Gurdjieff says that as children, we learn insincerity. You know, and he hated when parents would go, "What do you say? Thank you." And it becomes such an automatum. But as children, we learn to hide behind this mask. And so when you're talking about finding something deeper, you know, more connecting with your essence, more connecting with that deeper part of yourself, and using the word insincerity, realizing that, you know, you have these moments where you're sort of on the border, and you could flip one way, but you're catching yourself just at the right moment. I mean, initially, at least for myself, when I think back years ago, it would be like I would have this recording of my actions, and, you know, hours later I would realize, oh, I didn't do, and then, you know, an hour later, then half an hour later, and then, you know, eventually moving back to actually catch yourself at that point. And then to try and catch yourself before that point. To catch yourself before that point is really, you know, a product of hydrogen 24. Twice as fast, twice as intelligent, twice as perceptive as 48, as the normal realm, as the realm of personality. So for me, it was a slow process over years and years. Are you able to catch yourself before you do it now? Or do you just observe yourself quickly afterwards and in quick enough time to kind of rectify it? Or
I would say most often I don't catch myself and am able to rectify it. And that's kind of the embarrassing part for me, is I have to watch myself still do it. because I can't genuinely, sincerely be like, no, I'm stopping this. I'm making a decision to do something different. The forces inside are too strong, but I take it as a form of intentional suffering of like, no, I'm gonna watch myself fuck this up. I have to admit that I am powerless here. I have to admit that I can't do what I want to do. And the hope is, as I, that doing so will increase my attention to the point where I can catch it before and actually make better choices. Some of the time I do, but it's like right on that cusp.
Bringing that conscious or intentional suffering to it immediately after when you notice it is a wonderful technique, which will, when done over time, help you get in front of it. So recognizing it and feeling that remorse for having done it, and it will over time help you get in front of it. But yeah, no, that's great that you're feeling that remorse, that suffering of doing it, and you're catching yourself just sort of still in time to experience that suffering and to recognize, rather than thinking about it the day later and go, oh boy, did I mess up yesterday. The closer you can get back to the time you messed up, the better. And then to bring that remorse, because, remorse of conscience, remorse is one of the most transformative elements in the universe. It's the real key to understanding suffering, is having that remorse. And, Mr. Gurdjieff said one quote, like, suffer for your defects, suffer for all the things you do wrong, and you will grow from that. Okay.
Can I say a couple of quick things?
Sure, please.
One question and one more of an observation. When you were talking about being, taught to be insincere as a kid, when I was a kid, one of the pressures on me as a kid was to always be right, especially in school. Like, don't make mistakes, be a good kid, don't fuck up. And I think a lot of my insincerity comes from that. And so I have this sort of image of myself as like, oh, I don't make mistakes. I always do things really well. And so it kind of adds a little bit of burn to that for me, because it goes right against this mechanical image I have of myself. And then the other thing I wanted to say real quick was a question. We were talking about having a sense of when we've done something right or when we haven't, and not to the level of perfectionism, but still that sense. Is that one way of talking about conscience? Is that sense of rightness?
I suppose so.
The way you talked about remorse of conscience, it seems like it would be, but.
Yeah, no, I think it is, as Mr. Gurdjieff said, every stick always has two ends. And so that would be on the other end of the stick. Satisfaction. And, he said that most people, are self-satisfied. They're not self-satisfied. That would probably be the wrong word. But they're just a little too satisfied with themselves, a little too patting themselves on the back. But self-satisfaction, anything that Mr. Gurdjieff preceded with the word self and a hyphen, was a form of mindful awareness. And so egocentric satisfaction, would be something dirty, not worthy, but self-satisfaction in having done a job right and having done something properly is something that, we should be striving to achieve as well. So, it's one of those things, like there's the wrong use of imagination, and then there's the right use of imagination, active being mentation, or the wrong form of self-love and the right form of self-love. So it's one of those things that there's a lower subjective quality and there's a higher proper quality. The self-satisfaction in having done something properly, having done something the right way with proper intent and mindful awareness, is a good quality, as long as it doesn't reek of the ego, and as long as the ego isn't hidden beneath that sense of self-satisfaction. If it's an objective sense of self-satisfaction rather than subjective, or impersonal rather than personal. So an impersonal objective sense of satisfaction is a good thing. So let's just quickly, why am I not there? Do a little bit of inner work. So I work for myself, I work for mankind, I work for the earth herself. I wish to be, I can be, I have the right to be, I have the ability to be. I swear to myself that this will never be for my personal profit, but to help others. I wish to be to help others. This is to be understood as a vow. So let's begin and let's just bring our awareness back to our body. Just sensing your body in whatever way you can, aware of your body. And then let's bring our attention to the top of our head and relax the top of our head. Then relaxing our forehead, relaxing our eyebrows, really letting go and relaxing as best we can in our eyes and all of the muscles associated with the eyes. And I should point out here, relaxing the eyes is a very, very important step. Within hypnosis, we really focus as hypnotherapists on helping our clients relax their eyes. We hold a lot of tension in our eyes, and there are various muscles around our eyes that we can relax. Then relax your nose, the muscles in your face. Relax the finer muscles in the sides of your head, your ears. Relaxing your lips, your chin, your jaw. Moving inside, relaxing the inside of your mouth, the inside of your throat. Relaxing your neck, your throat and neck. Relaxing your shoulders. Relaxing your upper arms. Letting go, doing nothing in your lower arms. Relaxing your hands and fingers. And then moving to your chest, relaxing all the muscles in your chest. Relaxing your solar plexus, your midriff, and then moving down and relaxing your abdomen. And then moving to your upper back and shoulder blades and relaxing them. Relaxing your middle back, your lower back. Relaxing your hips, your buttocks. Relaxing your upper legs, lower legs. Relaxing your feet, your ankles, the top and bottom of your feet, your toes and heels, and even try to relax the bones in your feet. And then breathe up to the top of your head. And then as you breathe out, send a wave of relaxation all the way down to the bottom of your feet as you breathe out. Following your own natural breathing, your own rhythm of breathing, breathing into the top of your head, and just relaxing your whole body as you breathe out, all the way down to the bottom of your feet. Breathing into the top of your head, do this one final time, and relaxing your whole body down to the bottom of your feet. Mr. Gurdjieff says that the ability to relax the body is a prerequisite for inner work. And we should get to the point where we can breathe in and just relax the body with our first breath down, and then breathe into the top of our head, relax again, and do it a third time and relax again. And very quickly enter into this relaxed state. Now let's do Mr. Gurdjieff's filling exercise. As a vessel fills with warm golden honey, begin to slowly fill your body with sensation, beginning with the bottom of your feet, and then filling with sensation up through your feet, up into your ankles, into your lower legs, up into your knees, your upper legs, up to your hips, and at your hips also fill with sensation into your hands. And then moving from the bottom of your feet, filling with sensation up through the lower part of your torso, your lower arms, your abdomen, lower back, up to your midriff, middle back, solar plexus, filling with sensation up through your upper back, upper arms, chest, up to your shoulders. And then filling with sensation slowly up through your neck, into your head, and then level with your mouth, and then moving up to level with your nose, level with your eyes and ears, and then filling with sensation all the way to the top of your head. Sensing your body from the bottom of your feet to the top of your head. Sensing your body from side to side, from front to back, really aware of your whole body. Sensing your body as one organic whole. Use Mr. Gurdjieff's phrase, the sensation of self. And as I've mentioned in the last few meetings, when we are fully aware of our body, when we can sense our entire body at once, we are actually lawfully using C12. We are not misusing it on imagination, on daydreams, on negative emotions, or even positive emotions that at their basis have the taint of the ego. When we are sensing our body as one organic whole, in this moment, we are lawfully using C12. Now, someone on Facebook, last week I issued a challenge, anyone asking me questions about what I've talked about in terms of the misuse of C12, asked me a question, and at first I misinterpreted and I misunderstood the question from a slightly wrong angle. I've got certain antenna, and my antenna, the way I tell it my clients, it's 90% right and 10% wrong. And so my antenna was attuned in a different way. And let me just come over to the question. So his name is William. There is a question from last week. Do we need to be discerning with regard to the quality of impressions or influences that we engage? That is, listening to Bach versus culture pop bands, or reading world history instead of romance novels, etc. So is the quality of impressions important? And here my spidey senses were completely off. This focus on impressions, this focus on art and clothing and luxurious surroundings is one of the chief focuses of a cult that has stolen and misused the Gurdjieff teachings, called the Fellowship of Friends. The Fellowship of Friends, they believe in wearing $1,000 suits, going to art galleries and looking at art and paintings and various different things like that. And they all present it as a way of raising the quality of impressions that we can perceive. And it's not true. I remember once there was the Fellowship of Friends. They used to have a chapter in Toronto. Once the internet, got big and people began to search on the internet, the organization fell apart. There used to be something like 35 members in Toronto. I think they were down to 4, maybe 5 when I bumped into them. And they held a meeting sort of in a cafe at a hotel near the subway. And I had a sense they were the Fellowship of Friends. So I dressed as grungily as I could. I had an old jean jacket and my old winter coat that had a pocket half ripped off. And I went there and there was a man and a woman there and they were dressed to the nines. I mean, that man, a suit, if it cost under $1,000, I would be surprised. And the woman had pearls and it took them a while before they actually admitted they were Fellowship of Friends. But when that question was first, sent to me on Facebook, I wrongly thought this is what the Fellowship of Friends focus on. So I took that approach, but I'm not going to show my response to that. I just asked him if he was. I didn't explain why I said that, but they're all about going to art galleries and various different things, believing that by doing that, they're able to raise the level of impressions that they feed on, which, as I will show, is not true. So going back to this. So this is actually later on in the questioning, after I said, are you Fellowship of Friends? And then he said, you know, in part, the basis of the question was connected with the prolific amount of negative and instant communication, news and social media that is taking place today. It's almost smothering, and often I find myself retreating back into the classics and other material that is more substantial. News and influence of that nature certainly seems like it's in a different category, more fleeting than deeper stories that depict the nature of people, that is, war and peace. So my question was formulated around the nature of this material. Is it relevant? Is it of value to engage more to engage in more difficult and material of a greater quality? So the interesting thing about what William was asking me, he didn't quite phrase it correctly, but how do we properly and lawfully use the intellectual center? What are proper and lawful endeavors for the emotional center? So I've been focusing on the wrong use or the misuse of C12, how it's stolen by the other centers. And he was really approaching this question from a different perspective. So, you know, if in the sensation of self, if in this awareness of our physical body from the bottom of our feet to the top of our head, we are lawfully using C12, what kind of lawful activities can we engage in order to properly use our intellectual and emotional centers? Now, he didn't quite phrase it this way, but this is really what he was asking at the core of his question. So one of his questions was about history and reading history books. And so I said, have you read Tales? In it, Mr. Gurdjieff is very specific in his condemnation of learned beings of the new formation. He was particularly brutal on historians and how they have warped and distorted history. And this is one of the things about Tales, where Mr. Gurdjieff says that his whole aim is to upend everything that you think you know and to kind of leave you doubting everything. And one of the groups of people that he particularly condemns is historians. You know, in the fictional voice as Beelzebub, he talks about having been an eyewitness to certain historical events and then seeing how they were written about later generations, and there was minimal connection with what actually happened. And here, learned beings of the new formation, at a certain point, our consciousness and subconsciousness were fully united. And then our conscious awareness broke off. And it's like our consciousness and our subconsciousness are separated. And Mr. Gurdjieff says we have to bring our conscious and our subconscious back into alignment. And one of the ways that we do this is through mindfulness. For instance, unless you are fully aware of your body, a moment ago, the bottom of your feet your subconscious mind was fully aware of the bottom of your feet. Now that I'm talking about the bottom of your feet, now that you've become mindful of it, this area within your awareness is harmonized. A moment ago, your subconscious mind was fully aware of the sensation of your body. Now that I've brought it into the conscious awareness, and hopefully you are aware of your whole body, your conscious and subconscious have come back into alignment. And every act of mindful awareness, whether it's mindfully listening, smelling, seeing, tasting, the mindful awareness of our physical body, the mindful awareness of our feelings, all of these involve this harmonization between the subconscious and the conscious and bringing them back into alignment. He talks about the big problem is our conscious mind has become so separated from our subconscious mind. This manifests in the personality, our personality, it manifests in a number of ways. And when he's talking about learned beings of the new formation, he's talking about people that they live in their personality and they live in their conscious mind, and they're completely separated and divorced from all of these subconscious processes, from the true depth of their being. So just to explain, what I meant by learned beings of the new formation. And then I said, I guess you haven't read some of the books by his students and the brutal comments he made to a few of the novelists. Writing a novel is just one big adventure in the wrong use of imagination. I forget exactly which one of his students, but he had a number of them who were novelists. And one of them asked about the special state that they entered. It was almost like a dreamlike reverie where they get into that state and they begin writing. And he just poof, and said that state is garbage. It's just, he didn't use the word, the misuse of C12, but his whole approach to it was, that is not a special state. It's not a special reverie. It's you getting caught up in your imagination, getting caught up in that world. So Mr. Gurdjieff didn't really have a positive feeling for novelists. If you read Tales, you will realize, he criticizes novelists and novels and writers over and over and over again. Can we do it through novels and reading? If you want to read something that will more closely lead you to objective truths, he recommended reading scientific textbooks. So you would be better off reading Scientific American or Lancet. Here's a quote from one of his students. Or actually, I think this might have been, well, we'll find out in a minute, Paris Talks, wartime meetings. So the questioner, SR, when I try to remember myself during the day, I notice that I often feel an emotion, but at the same time, I feel that my head is empty. What can I do for the head? And try and remember your body. Try to self-sense as I scroll up. This comes from a lack of information. You do not have any material. It is not your fault. Your head has not been educated. It has not learned anything much. It is poor and uncultured. You have no knowledge. You must acquire scientific knowledge. This will bring associative material for your thinking. Read, study chemistry, astronomy. It doesn't matter. You need to acquire knowledge. There are many scientific books with objective qualities. And so this is actually in a specific book that was just recently published, G.I. Gurdjieff Paris Meetings 1943, which expands on the material available in the transcripts from 1938 to 1946. They go through all the meetings, and it's a much more detail. So here he is saying that science is involved in the quest for objective truths, for understanding things more objectively from a more objective perspective. So if you want to educate the head brain, if you want to engage the head brain in a proper pursuit, something that will lead to more objective results, to begin to explore science. You know, perhaps Scientific American and Lancet are well beyond your ability to understand. You know, perhaps start with nature magazines or scientific documentaries or things like that. You know, mathematics, you know, the physics, astrophysics, there are objective truths to be found in science, far more than in novels, far more than in fictional writing. So if you want to engage in a head brain activity that educates the head brain, sort of brings it slightly into alignment with objective truths, study scientific material. You know, get a copy of Nature magazine. You know, go to this the Smithsonian Institute website. They've got a lot of fascinating articles there. There are a lot of online science magazines, Science Digest magazines. Now, scientists aren't perfect, but the scientific method is self-correcting. I was kind of fortunate in the fact that my father was a scientist, and I was raised with science almost as my religion. Science may make mistakes, but everything you do has to be replicable in another laboratory. I was about to say laboratory. Betray my roots as a child, because my father always said laboratory, the British way of saying it. You've got to be able to replicate it somewhere else, following the instructions. And a lot of scientific studies, a lot of things that make the headlines have been debunked when other scientists have gone and looked at it and realized that there was a flaw in the methodology or whatever. You know, scientism, you know, a lot of people are really against that when it becomes an ideology, but the scientific method is self-correcting. And they are, in a sense, trying to discover objective truths and objective aspects about reality. But scientists are very much human. You know, the whole, you know, advent of the Nobel Prize in various different sciences, the giving of grants and awards has in a big way warped science because it's fueled the ego and things that have the taste of the ego underneath. You know, there's something a little dirty about them, even if they do push the scientific field forward. You meet scientists, you meet people in academia, and a lot of them are very vain, petty, egotistical, almost nasty childlike beings, particularly those at the top of their field, because they've been treated almost like they were deities from high school and pampered and given exceptions and, you know, given passes for being decent people, and they haven't developed themselves in a fully rounded way. And then this ties into what A.O. Araj said, that towering luminaries in their fields. So whether it's science or art or sports, he said they're all psychopaths because they're not three-brain beings and they haven't developed all three of their brains. So there's that caveat with science, but it's a way where we can begin to explore more scientific, more objective truths. Whoops. Just try to sense your body, try to become aware of your body, sensing your body. as one organic whole. Me again. He also said that you can turn reading into an inner exercise. Most reading is just feeding the head brain, but it takes time and practice. Normal reading has become an automaton, a habit that must be broken. Think back to childhood, when reading was so difficult. You had to learn to differentiate a B from a D. And here, people with dyslexia have real problems with these two letters because they are the mirror image of each other. And as children, we had to learn to distinguish them and had to sound out each letter, had to sound each letter out to hear the word. Just like when we first learned to ride a bicycle. So as children, we didn't have this automaton, we developed it. But somewhere along the way, it became so habitual, so automatic, that reading puts us into a state of waking sleep. This is why Tales is so hard to read, because Mr. Gurdjieff wrote it in such a way that it is impossible to read from within that automaton. The sentences, the commas, the 450 neologisms, or words that he invented, and not just little tiny words, but being, part, goal, duty, which really is conscious labors and intentional suffering, and, heptapara parshinok, or the law of seven, creating these mouthy words that you had to sound out and figure out. And he prevented you from reading that book in the normal, automatic way. You really had to pay attention to reading that book. And it's probably the best book you can read to break free from a lot of the automatons that exist within writing. So when you stop reading novels and start reading classics, you are just replacing one prison with another. William said, rather than reading novels, what about War and Peace? So think back. Okay, I duplicated myself there. And Mr. Gurdjieff, I love this advice. Again, it's from the transcripts of wartime meetings. Practice reading with your three centers. SR. Recently, I have begun to read again, but I'm finding once more in myself what has always prevented me from working, a kind of greed that after a while leaves me tired and without having retained anything. My time has been wasted. Gurdjieff. This is because you read only with your head. Do this exercise. Read just a little, one page at a time. First, you have to understand with your head. Then you have to feel. Then experience. And then go back, reflect on it. Practice reading with your three centers. In reading any book, there is material for enriching yourself. It doesn't matter what you read. The quantity doesn't matter. Only the quality of how you read. This is a fascinating exercise. There was one person who came up with the theory that you had to read tales as pictures. And to an extent, they got something, but mentation by form is more than just visualizing. We can imagine reaching out to a door handle with an imaginary arm. We can imagine what it's like to walk down the street. We can imagine smelling in fresh baked bread, the scent of fresh baked bread. We can imagine hearing music, a symphony. So to read with mentation by form. So, this phrase, in reading any book. You know, visually, to imagine reading, to imagine a book. You know, there is material, representing material. You know, whether or not it's a physical material, a physical substance, there is a material for enriching. How would you visualize? How would you represent enriching to yourself? And then putting yourself with the word yourself. It doesn't matter what you read. So matter, it doesn't matter. How would you visualize this? How would you imagine this with all of your sensory detail? It doesn't matter what you, and coming back to you, picturing yourself reading, the quantity. So you could imagine piles of textbooks. Doesn't matter, only the quality of how you read. And then to try to read this with your feelings. You know, in reading any book, there is material for enriching yourself. Enriching, it can be, you can imagine piles of gold or money, but you can imagine this from an emotional level, enriching yourself. It doesn't matter what you read, the quantity doesn't matter, only the quality of how you read. When we read this paragraph with our emotions from our feeling center, it gives us, we're reading more of a flavor, more of a feeling, more of something different than with the mentation by thought or the mentation by form. And then we could go back in reading any book. So to imagine your body physically there, the experience of holding a book in your hand and reading a book. There is material for enriching yourself. So material, there's a very sensory quality to the word material, matter, material, enriching yourself, aware of your body. It doesn't matter what you read, again, imagining holding and reading a book. The quantity, imagining, you know, you've read a lot, doesn't matter, only the quality of how you read. So we can go back to any book, and you really have to slow down your reading. Oh, my daughter just came in, and go say hi. Just she doesn't live here anymore. She's going to move back in soon, but just waving at her.
Hi.
I just wondered why the dog was barking, and at any rate, this is her T-shirt that she did, so I can just show it. The artist, you can see it on the wall back there. She's saying hi to the dog right now. So it doesn't matter
Love you.
what we read, it's how we read it. So any novel, any passage, to what does it mean to read something with your head brain? What does it mean to read something with your feeling brain? What does it mean to read something with your moving instinctual center? And to go back and to tease these threads apart and read very specifically in this way is a proper way to engage in this behavior. I specifically focus on War and Peace because he said War and Peace. As to War and Peace, many, myself included, that believe that Mr. Gurdjieff wrote about Tolstoy in tales, lightly disguising his identity, Tolstoy's identity. And he was pretty contemptuous of that person's writing. And I use the word titillation and wiseacre. Most novels, titillation and wiseacre. Titillation is Mr. Gurdjieff's word for the misuse of C12. Whenever we engage in titillation, we read about love affairs and all of these things. And this is the quote that I pulled from Beelzebub Tales. And from that very day, he wiseacred away at his new gospel. The word wiseacred. So this means, learned being of the new formation, the conscious mind, just wiseacring, just, to use a contemporary expression, pardon my French, bullshitting, inventing, making up. And from that very day, he wiseacred away at his new gospel. But it was only when he had finished it, however, and had given it to the printers, that all the further events connected with this new gospel began. And the reason I say that a lot of us think that this is Tolstoy, and then he further, implicitly criticizes the writings of that individual, and it is because Tolstoy wrote the gospel in brief. He thought, well, according to Mr. Gurdjieff in Tales, or our dear grandfather Beelzebub, if Johnny and Mark and Matthew and them can do it, so can I. And so Tolstoy, he actually created a bit of a controversy, the gospel in brief. So this is why we think that when he's talking about that specific writer, he's speaking of Tolstoy, and he had a lot of contempt for normal writing, normal writers. So War and Peace, it's just a bigger, more elaborate misuse of imagination, and a bigger, more elaborate way of getting us caught up in misusing C12. So I have given up these quotes to William, and his response. I recognize what he's saying here. Obviously, reading long, difficult novels and works is different to reading daily news feeds. It takes a different approach to reading a War and Peace or an Anna Karenina. The effort has to be different just to get through those types of novels. To hold all of the characters and plots in mind day after day for a month is quite an effort. And to a degree, he has a point here. Harlequin romances, at least that's what they call them in Canada, Mills and Boons, they call them in the UK. Those women's novels, that are the actually amongst the best-selling novels in the world. War and Peace is obviously far superior to them. War and Peace is obviously far superior to a lot of the news feeds and the tweets and the limited attention we have now. But unless you read War and Peace in the right way, if you get caught up in it and completely lose awareness of yourself, you're not in the picture. And Mr. Gurdjieff talks about how keeping ourselves in the picture, and the way we actually do that is through the sensation of ourself. Wherever we are, when we lose this awareness of ourself, we are no longer present in that moment. So, I would recommend, rather than reading War and Peace, read Beelzebub Tales to his grandson. And then when you finish that, rather than reading War and Peace, read it a second time. And when you finish that, rather than reading War and Peace, read it a third time. It's an organic work of art. And to me, every time I read it, it grows, it changes. It's an amazing book that requires that attention. It requires that focus to keep all of the things in mind. He'll introduce a word without explaining what it is, say on page 200. The next time you see that word will be, say, page 600 and a little bit more. And then he sort of defines the word on page 900, and you've got to connect all of these in order to fully understand what that particular word means in its context. It requires a great deal of attention. People have called Tales movements of the mind. I mean, Mr. Gurdjieff's movements, the sacred temple dances. And in a sense, reading Tales is the equivalent. for sacred temple dances, for the movements, they may get one side of your body moving in a 3/3 beat and the other side moving in a 4/4 beat. And it requires a real high level of attention to engage in the movements, to learn in the movements. You lose focus and you've gotten lost. You've lost your steps. You have to stay in the present moment, focused, to learn movements. And the same with tails. You really have to put that extra effort into it. I was explaining last Tuesday to one of the people in my Tuesday evening group that when I tell myself I'm going to read tails, it's like I have to go into a 6-week training program before I read tails, because I know what an arduous struggle it will involve to get through that book. It requires a super effort, and it requires a really deep focusing of attention. In that way, it's an extraordinary book. I mean, how did Mr. Gurdjieff write that book? How did he do it? I mean, in part, he created a version that was complete by 1931, and then he completely rewrote it and added like an extra 500 pages. And he would have it read out at night to groups. He wouldn't read it. He would have someone read it to groups. And then he would watch the participants, the people listening, very carefully, and then go and tweak and go and work on elements of it. And this is also why there's a big misconception in terms of Beelzebub Tales to his grandson. There is no English translation. I want to make this clear. There is no English translation of Beelzebub Tales to his grandson. Madame Uspensky could read Russian and she could read English, and she thought the English version missed some things and wasn't quite like the Russian one. But Mr. Gurdjieff spent 25 years refining the English version. And when Madame Uspensky came up with her revised version, the English-speaking world rose up in arms. That version that was published in 1992 is no longer in print. The old version is back in print. Mr. Gurdjieff worked on every single word, every paragraph in the English version over his lifetime. There's a Russian version, which is different than the English version, but they were written for two different audiences. A.R. Orage was very implicated in the first round of the English version, but it is a standalone version, and it's written for the English-speaking mind, and he would have it read to English pupils, English-speaking pupils, and watch their reactions, and then go back and tweak it. So that's just an aside there. The English version was completely authorized by Mr. Gurdjieff. He went over every specific word, every paragraph. So anyone who says it's a translation doesn't understand the nature and development of the English version of Tales. And the English version is different than the Russian version. So if you think the Russian is the original, it isn't. They're both the original. So getting back to, now I'm beginning to realize where William is coming from. It took a while. Sometimes I'm a little slow in understanding these things. Now I get an intuition that you are really referencing this passage when asking this question. And this goes right back to the initial question, focusing on impressions. And this is the passage that so enamored Robert Earl Burton, the founder of Fellowship of Friends. And it's got many different incarnations, be present, and the most recent one is be period. If you are involved in be present, be period, the Fellowship of Friends, you are not involved in the Gurdjieff teachings. You are involved in the Robert Earl Burton misunderstanding of these teachings, and he only read In Search of the Miraculous, and then he went into Rodney Collins, and I consider that to be a whole degenerative octave. So Fellowship of Friends, Be Present, Be Period, a number of different names. They play, and they put a big emphasis on art and putting yourself in places where they claim there are higher impressions. But they have a completely mistaken and wrong understanding. Okay. When we talked before, I believe, let me just verify, sorry, that this is, I want to make sure, yeah, this is Mr. Gurdjieff being quoted by Peter Uspensky in Search of the Miraculous. This is the quote that the Fellowship of Friends, Be Period, Be Present, you know, they keep on shape-shifting and changing their name because people figure out who they are. If you become aware of the painting that they have for Mr. Gurdjieff, the painting they have for Uspensky, and the painting they have for Colin, you will recognize them by these paintings. They're on all of their websites. They're on all of their material. So once you become familiar with it, and they also like to have posts on Facebook with real beautiful pieces of art and really elaborately done. When we talked about the octaves of food and the three-story factory, this is Mr. Gurdjieff, we saw that all the finer hydrogens needed for the working, the growth, and the evolution of the organism were prepared from three kinds of foods. That is, from food in the strict meaning of the word, eatables and drink, from air, which we breathe, and from impressions. So the food we eat, the air we breathe, and the impressions we receive are the three different being foods. Now let us suppose that we could improve the quality of food and air. Feed, let us say, on hydrogen 384 instead of 768, and breathe hydrogen 96 instead of 192. So, eating food of a level higher and breathing in a level higher. How much simpler and easier the preparation of fine matters in the organism would be then. But the whole point is that this is impossible. The organism is adapted to transform precisely these coarse matters into fine matters. And if you give it fine matters instead of coarse matters, it will not be in a position to transform them, and it will, and as I scroll up, just sense your body as best you can, it will very soon die. Neither air nor food can be changed, but impressions, that is, the quality of impressions possible to man, are not subject to any cosmic law. Man cannot improve his food. He cannot improve the air. Improvement in this case would be actually making things worse. For instance, hydrogen 96 instead of 192 would be either very rarefied air or very hot, incandescent gases, which man cannot possibly breathe. Fire is hydrogen 96. It is exactly the same with food. Hydrogen 348 is water. If man could improve his food, that is, make it finer, he would also have to feed on water and breathe fire. It is clear that this is impossible. But while it is not possible for him to improve his food and air, he can improve his impressions to a very high degree, and in this way introduce fine hydrogens into the organism. It is precisely on this that the possibility of evolution is based. and just sensing your body again as I scroll up. A man is not at all obliged to feed on the dull impressions of hydrogen-48. He can have both hydrogen-24, hydrogen-12, and hydrogen-6, and even hydrogen-3. This changes the whole picture, and a man who makes higher hydrogens, the food for the upper story of his machine, will certainly differ from the one who feeds on the lower hydrogens in search of the miraculous. Whoops. Let me see if I can go to the. Sorry. So this is my response. And as lofty as this sounds, imagine being able, hydrogen-3, the holy reconciling. Hydrogen-6, the holy, in other words, the divine, the holy denying. Imagine being able to feed on those hydrogens, even being able to feed on hydrogen-12, on me-12 of the octave of impressions. If we were able to do that, we would so dramatically change our existence, change our being. But, the fellowship of friends, be period, be present, misunderstand this. Going and standing in front of a painting by Renoir or whatever doesn't automatically elevate the food that you eat. And here the key to understanding this is found in the last sentence above. A man who makes higher hydrogens the food for the upper story of his machine will certainly differ from one who feeds on the lower hydrogens. You can't just click your fingers and feed on me-12 or La-6 of the octave of impressions, though you can feed on Ray-24. For a normal person, for a person beginning the work on this path, the highest they can feed on is Ray-24. And they can only do this one way. And here, Mr. Gurdjieff again, in Search of the Miraculous. Efforts to remember oneself, observation of oneself at the moment of receiving an impression. So just take a moment and become aware of your eyes, become aware of your ears, become aware of your eyes in this moment, receiving this visual impression. Become aware of your ears in this moment, receiving the auditory impressions. So efforts to remember oneself, observation of oneself at the moment of receiving an impression, observation of one's impressions at the moment of receiving them, registering, so to speak, the reception of impressions and the simultaneous defining of the impressions received, all taken together, doubles the intensity of the impressions and carries Do 48 to Ray 24. So it is not the act of standing in front of a Van Gogh or a Renoir or going to the Louvre or wherever and just looking mechanically at the art. It's not even the art itself that elevates our ability to feed on hydrogen-24, on Ray-24. It is the act of mindful awareness, the act of self-remembering, becoming aware of our eyes as they are receiving visual impressions, becoming aware of our ears receiving auditory impressions, becoming aware, mindful of our nose receiving olfactory impressions, becoming aware of our taste buds receiving gustatory impressions. This awareness, this mindful awareness of receiving external impressions, not doing it mechanically, but with mindful awareness, is feeding on Ray 24. And we have to feed on Ray 24 for a long period of time, going back to what I've talked about before. In terms of the building up crystallizations, crystallizing things within ourselves. We slowly crystallize and form these structures within ourselves. So it takes a while to crystallize, and doing this at the level of hydrogen 24, the crystallizations that occur within us, the impressions that get impressed within us that are at this vibration, at this level. Those crystallizations, when done in the proper form and sequence, and that's the name of one of the last chapters in Beelzebub Tales, done in the proper form and sequence, create our Kesdjan body. And then the Kesdjan body, then having that, allows us to then begin feeding on the next level up, on hydrogen 12. We're not able, when we are in the normal state, when we haven't done a lot of work on ourselves, from feeding on anything higher than hydrogen 24, with the octave of impressions. When we talk about impressions, I'm just wondering, okay, I'm going to leave this next part to next week, because I've got actually so many things. You can see the little tabs I've got up. I'll just read it now so that we can get a sense of also where he's coming from. William, now, and this, he's quoting me, now I get an intuition that you are really referencing this passage when asking this question. So that was this passage about impressions, and quite right. This is in part what I was getting at. Also, when you read pages 199 to 204 in Search of the Miraculous, which talk about A, B, and C influences, it all falls into place. B influences can be transmitted via the written word, novel, poem, or scientific text, etc. I would imagine that each work could have a greater or lesser degree of B influence. The Bible would be an example of work that is high in B influence. From what I'm reading, B influences are higher influences created outside of life and introduced into life, where a man can receive more or less of these influences. If he separates the first from the second kind of influences and accumulate them, this could be the beginning of a magnetic center. Hence the question about A influences created within life, news, social media, and B influences. After reading 199 to 2004 in Search of the Miraculous, it becomes somewhat clearer now. And it's a large passage. I'm going to save that for next week. The whole concept of A, B, and C influences. I've got diagrams, I've got all sorts of things. I kind of suspected I wouldn't have the time to do it today, but the next meeting will be devoted to the difference between A, B, and C influences, and understanding where Uspensky went real wrong in his attempt to depict this. But, William was coming from the place, when I've been talking about C12, I engaged in a thought experiment, and imagine monks and people who have taken the monastic vow, and everything involved in living in a monastery, isolated from the world, fleeing the world, giving up your name, cutting your hair, taking vows of celibacy and everything, were all created and designed to prevent the misuse of C12. So the monastic life, if we use it as a thought experiment and realize the elaborate techniques and processes that they've gone through to prevent the misuse of C12, we can begin to get a better understanding of C12, almost like, the difference between, the old photographs, the negative and the positive of the old photograph, studying the negative, studying the monastic tradition. And where William was coming from was, he didn't really articulate it, but when I finally understood what he was asking was, well, how can we properly use our head brain or the intellectual center and our feeling brain or the feeling center and our body brain or the physical center? How can we begin to engage in activities that are better for it? One is, and he's very right about these influences, In Search of the Miraculous is a higher influence. Beelzebub Tales is a higher influence. The Bible is certainly a higher influence. Holy Scriptures, sacred texts are all higher influences. So rather than, reading about what Brittany did, or I'm dating myself, I don't know who now, Cardi B does, or whatever, reading Buddhist texts, or reading In Search of the Miraculous, or reading, Rumi, the Persian Sufi poet. Those would all be higher influences. I'm not convinced that War and Peace and Anna Karenina are higher influences. Now, this being said, I've never, ever read War and Peace or Anna Karenina. I've never even had an iota of desire to read them. It just hasn't been on my radar. I encountered the Gurdjieff teachings 38 years ago when I was 23, and that knocked me out of normal life. So I went and studied religion and Hinduism and the Bible and all sorts of other stuff that I find far more fascinating. So I'm not, I think novelists and writing novels is a misuse of C12. But again, I can't talk about War and Peace because I've never read it, or Anna Karenina. But my guess is, and Mr. Gurdjieff is very harsh on that writer of the Gospels in Tales and all of the other work that he wrote, and thinly veiled Tolstoy. So people probably asked him those questions about Tolstoy, especially the Russians, who were the first part of the group of people that he talked to. So that's just my opinion off the top of my head. Don't have much time for questions, but try to read. Try to do that exercise. It's fascinating. Doesn't matter what you read. Try to read first with your head. So the head-brain imagination. We can imagine reaching out. We can imagine smelling, baked bread. We can imagine hearing the sound of birds. We can imagine the taste of sugar in our mouth or honey. Reading with the head brain, with the words, so mentation by thought and mentation by form. And then reading with the feeling brain. And actually, this is where novels have a slight advantage, because novels are written to engender a certain feeling. They're not written as academic texts. They're not written attempting to discern objective truths. They are written to play with most people's feeling centers. And so novels do give us a way to read more with feeling. And then to read from a physical perspective. And to try to do this. Like I said, it's a very fascinating process. Has anyone, the three of you, tried this at all?
No.
No.
I
Ian?
have, yeah, I think, I don't know. What I try and do is when I'm reading, to maintain as much as I can a sensation, the sensation of my body, and it helps me to the way I try to describe it to myself is it helps me to feel into the meaning of the text, like what what's being conveyed, particularly in fiction, but what's being conveyed through the story that's being told. Even nonfiction has a narrative quality to it, and then there's a sort of I'm more conscious of taking in that story or that meaning, the underlying narrative, and I can sort of fit it into what I already have, as opposed to just glomming it on top. It sort of integrates better when I can remember to stay present in that way.
Yeah, I mean, to stay present wherever we are, Mr. Gurdjieff asked Uspensky and the others, do you think the most interesting thing about the work is? And they came up with all these things, and he said, it's that you're not present in your observations. You are not here. And this is where Uspensky has created more problems with our understanding of self-remembering, because he confuses the English word feel with sense. Did you feel that? Yeah, I felt that. And so, to sense, to be aware of our physical body in reading, to be aware of ourself reading. Yeah, that's a very good exercise. At any rate, thank you for all being here today. Thank you for those of you watching on Facebook. Any questions, send them to me. Thank you, William, for sending those questions. I misunderstood, but I explained why I misunderstood the initial question, but it was a wonderful question. Very related to the misuse of C12. How do we lawfully use our other centers? So, and I will be going into the C influences and all of that next meeting, next week. So thank you for being here. Take care. Hope you have a good day, and bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Allan.
Yeah.
Bye.